Hello, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this special session on Eurasian geopolitics titled Grand Chessboard to Card Table, Great Powers and the Emerging Order in the Silk Road region, organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. I'm Soham Das. Tillotoma Foundation works globally in the areas of international relations, diplomacy, area studies, gender, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. The distinguished speaker for this special session is Mr. Damjan Krnjević Mišković, former special advisor to the President of Serbia and former senior special advisor to the President of the United Nations General Assembly. He has also been the Director of Policy Planning and Analysis of the Presidential Administration of Serbia. He is presently a professor of practice at the ADA University at Baku. Thank you, Mr. Damjan Krnjević Mišković, for being here among us. It is our great pleasure to have you among us at this event. Professor Robert M. Cutler, Associate Director, Canada Office, Tillotoma Foundation, will be the discussant for this special session. Professor Cutler at the Canada Office, Tillotoma Foundation, has played an important role in curating this session. We will also have Ms. Kamakshi Wason, Vice President and Director of Academic Programs, Tillotoma Foundation, moderating the interactive discussion. We are here to discuss a very interesting subject. The Eurasian region, including the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, remains a crucial focus area of the Tillotoma Foundation. Over the years, the foundation has worked extensively on this region. The conceptualization of the historical Silk Road, of course, remains a very important idea within the context of Eurasian geopolitics. The title for today's session is very promising. I'm excited about this talk and look forward to today's session and would now request our today's speaker, Mr. Damjan Krnjević, to begin with his address. Over to you, Mr. Krnjević.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon or good evening. It's my honor to join you from ADA University in Baku in Azerbaijan. Thank you to the Tillotoma Foundation for the kind invitation and the introduction. Now, I believe that on today's date in 1918, something very interesting happened in the history of India. The Montford Reforms were made public for the first time, right? This infamously inadequate British attempt to introduce rather limited self-government to the Raj. And as I'm sure you know, it met with strong disapproval across the Indian political spectrum. Now, this triggered the imposition of the Rollout Acts in I think it was March 1919, which among other things extended the wartime state of emergency imposed by the British. You had clauses that allowed for indefinite imprisonment without due process and things like that. And this in turn led to Jinnah's resignation from the Imperial Legislative Council. And most famously, it led to Gandhi standing at the front of large-scale protests that brought him to broad nationwide attention for the first time. And these protests, you have the Amritsar massacre a month later, and then this gave Gandhi a platform to advocate more persuasively for nonviolence and so on, right? Now, I'm mentioning all of this not only because the failure of the Montford Reforms is one of those historically pivotal events, that happened on this day in 1918, as I said, but also because its spirit, in a way, has something rather profound to do with our topic this afternoon, which is basically about the geopolitics of the great powers and the emerging order in this region, in this part of the world that I've been living in for the past couple of years. And I hope that you'll understand what I mean by all of this by the time I'm done in about more or less 45 minutes. So with this in mind, I'd like to start by asking and then by answering a rather simple question. How do we call this part of the world? What do specialists call this part of the world that I'm in? And I'm thinking here of the term, at a minimum, that encompasses 8 former Soviet republics that are UN member states, right? The 3 in the South Caucasus and the 5 in Central Asia. And in some circles, Afghanistan is included in this geographic understanding, right? Well, most of us say Eurasia, right? So let me give you some background on the use of this word and why I think we can all do better. Now, the term Eurasia was first used by an Austrian geologist named Edward Suess in 1885. And then about 20 years later, an Englishman named Halford Mackinder, who everybody's heard of, he's the first guy to use the term Eurasia in a geopolitical context. And he referred to it as the world's heartland, the globe's pivot area, and all that stuff, right? So the idea that Eurasia is the ultimate geopolitical playground, the key to the acquisition and the maintenance of global power. Now, it's obviously more complex than that, and I don't have time to get into his policy prescriptions or to discuss criticisms of his thesis, but that's the basic idea. That's how we got to the use of the term Eurasia in everyday geopolitical discourse. And there's also a Russian connotation, because the term Eurasia was used in the 20s and the 30s in emigre circles in Paris and elsewhere. The writings of Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy are a good reference point, although the conceptual roots ultimately go back to the famous debate between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers in Tsarist times. And here you can read the pioneering work of Chadayev and some Dostoevsky and Mackinder's Russian contemporary Vladimir Lemansky and so on. But the point is that the view represented by those in both the West and Russia that made the use of the term Eurasia was revived with modifications after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And in Russia, it was updated and expanded, and this is a long and complicated story that's not directly relevant to what I want to discuss today. If you want to know more, you can read Dmitry Trenin for a serious view and Alexander Dugin for what we can call the rock and roll view of the contemporary Russian understanding of Eurasia. But in the West, and here's where it becomes interesting, in the West, a new version of the idea of Eurasia was promoted by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and who, like his boss, was actually more influential in retirement than during the 4 years both were in power. So my point is, at the height of his influence and authority, in 1997, Brzezinski came up with this famous definition of what he and over time the West began to understand Eurasia as being, right? And he argued he basically said from Lisbon to Vladivostok, that's Eurasia. And this was contained in an influential foreign affairs article and the book that came out in 1997. And well, as it happens, this definition from Lisbon to Vladivostok is more or less the present day OSCE space minus North America. And it also happens to match the boundaries of the superstate Eurasia as depicted by George Orwell in 1984. Now, the narrower everyday definition that I mentioned a moment ago, so Central Asia plus South Caucasus, this corresponds to what Brzezinski termed Eurasia's vast middle space. And the sentence that he uses is this: stretching between the western and eastern extremities of Eurasia, pay attention now, is a sparsely populated and currently politically fluid and organizationally fragmented vast middle space. Now, this is basically a paraphrase of formulations employed by Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy in the 1920s, and I can give you some citations later if it interests you. Now, one of the main differences is that unlike Trubetskoy, Brzezinski famously advocated for what he called benign American hegemony in this vast middle space, with the United States playing the role of Eurasia's arbiter, and so on. Okay, now that's enough background. I will come back to Brzezinski later on, but for now, my basic point is that there is something artificial, even Orientalist, about this word or this term Eurasia and the concepts that lie behind it, whether they're Western or Russian. And over the course of our time together this evening, it should become clear why the term Eurasia is inferior to the conceptual term that I'm proposing to replace it, Silk Road region. And that's one of the propositions that I want to put forward today. So to start with, let me give you my definition of the Silk Road region, which I would say consists of a single geopolitical theater with multiple stages. Okay, so in terms of geography, the definition is purposefully and constructively ambiguous. Basically, the Silk Road region comprises that part of the world that looks west past Anatolia to the warm seas beyond, north across the Caspian towards the Great Steppe, east to the peaks of the Altai and the arid sands of the Taklamakan, and south towards the Hindu Kush and the Indus Valley, and then looping down around to the Persian Gulf and back up across the Fertile Crescent and onward to the Black Sea Littoral. So that's geographically Silk Road region. Now, another advantage of the term Silk Road region is that it doesn't define the region in terms of any external power or national ideology. Now, instead, it focuses discussion where it should be focused, on the character of the region itself, on its distinctive geographical, cultural, and economic features, and on the question of whether those features may be the keys to its future. Okay, so that's the start of my pitch for Silk Road region. Now, I want to speak for another, 40 minutes on the assigned topic, and I'll do so by making 3 substantive points. So point number 1, the balance of power in the Silk Road region is not just shifting, it's transforming. And there are 3 main events that are accelerating this strategic trend. And they are the outcome of the Second Karabakh War, the US-led withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the weakening of Russia due to the Western-led sanctions and export restrictions regime that are imposed as part of the escalation that was triggered in February this year. So I'm going to explain all this by looking at some of the most important geopolitical consequences of these 3 events. And I can summarize the cumulative effect of these in the following manner. Regionally driven economic connectivity is on the way in. Outside power agenda setting is on the way out. And some outsiders are seeing their relative power decline. Others are seeing an increase. But in the aggregate, the power of outsiders is being reduced overall in the Silk Road region. That's point number 1. And I'm going to talk about that in detail in just a few minutes. The second point that I want to be making as part of this lecture is this: the grand chessboard metaphor that has framed geopolitical thinking about the Silk Road region for such a long time is outdated and flawed and just plain wrong. And it's a term and a concept popularized by Brzezinski, and I'll propose and explain its replacement, that of a card table. Okay. Point number 3 that I want to make today, which derives from the first 2, is that the Silk Road region is no longer merely an object of great power relations. It's on the cusp of becoming a distinct, autonomous, and emancipated subject of international order. And I'll come to this assessment by examining the Silk Road region's emerging set of initiatives and institutions that, when you take them together, may herald the onset of a stable and lasting order. So that's what I want to do today. And let's get into all of this by starting with the first main point. The balance of power in the Silk Road region is in the midst of a transformative shift. It's a balance of power that favors homegrown integration, with both its main architects and core participants belonging to the region itself. Now, like I've said, this great shift has been both accelerated and entrenched by the geopolitical consequences of 3 events: the outcome of the Second Karabakh War, the outcome of the US-led withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Russia's preoccupation with the conflict over Ukraine. Now, let me give you my top 10 list of these consequences. 1, conflict mediation, economic development efforts, and state-building campaigns engineered or at least actively encouraged by the West are in more than a usual state of flux. So here's what we have. On the one hand, you've got these kind of Western efforts in the Central Asian part of the Silk Road region have been sort of broken before completion, right? They've either been ineffective or unsuccessful. So think of Afghanistan. And the point holds for the 5 other countries of Central Asia. And this has had an impact on how the whole bunch of other states perceive Western postures and Western power in that part of the world going forward. Now, on the other hand, conflict mediation, economic development efforts, and state-building campaigns actively encouraged by the West in the South Caucasus part of the Silk Road region are being boosted, right? So one example, the EU's new role as a facilitator or a mediator in the peace process involving Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, this began before the war in Ukraine, but it has accelerated. The trend has accelerated since then, and European engagement has accelerated since then and deepened. Still, the EU's facilitation of that peace process shouldn't be understood to mean that the Russians are down, much less out, but they're certainly distracted. And that has created an opening for the EU, and the EU, to its great credit, has actually taken advantage of that opening. And I want to just say one more thing about this Russian angle in the context of this. At the end of the day, peace in the South Caucasus, just like peace in Ukraine, is going to be impossible to achieve without Russia. And at least in Yerevan and Baku, this is quite well understood. No one has much confidence in the promise of liberal internationalism in the Silk Road region. Okay? But still, there is this increase in European engagement, which is being welcomed at least by the two main parties, Yerevan, Baku. So, point is, overall, Western engagement is in a heightened state of flux. The Marxists would even say that it's in a state of contradiction, right? Because there's greater engagement in the South Caucasus and muddling through and messes and all this stuff in Central Asia. Okay. So that was geopolitical consequence number one. Geopolitical consequence number two, the use of force by a Silk Road region state can propel cornerstone regional security objectives, especially if the military approach accords with the basic tenets of international law, as enshrined in the UN Charter and deriving documents. So I'm referring, obviously, to Azerbaijan here, right? In other words, those that claim that there was no military solution to the protracted conflict over Karabakh were manifestly incorrect. And this is also the case when it comes to Afghanistan, at least to a certain degree, and obviously in a different way, right? Power sharing agreements went out the window. Outright victory in a civil war was achieved, and it was achieved quite rapidly. And there was nothing the West could do to turn the tide. And the point is simple. Everyone in the region has basically learned to live with this new Taliban reality. Now, this is obviously to be contrasted by the recent turn of events in Ukraine, you know, on the issue of the legitimacy of the use of force and all that. However, I should underline that no state in the Silk Road region has joined the Western-led sanctions and export restrictions regime against Russia, even though they've reaffirmed or affirmed support for Ukraine's territorial integrity as a matter of principle. And yet, no core Silk Road region state has supplied any weapons to Ukraine. Also, in the UN General Assembly, only Afghanistan voted for the two resolutions in March of 2022, right, that condemned Russia's aggression and all this stuff. But the Afghan permanent representative, a credit to the UN, happens to represent the fallen government, not the Taliban. Now, the point is that the Silk Road region is a very non-aligned place, as it should be. Let's move on to geopolitical consequence number three. The Moscow-mediated documents that ended the Second Karabakh War represent far more than a narrow ceasefire agreement between belligerents. Now, when you read this document, and then you see that it mandates a broad, interconnected set of economic normalization arrangements. And once these are put fully into place, the consequences of all of this are going to reverberate far beyond Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, the strategically most important one is a direct road and rail route from Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan exclave through a slice of Armenia to mainland Azerbaijan. And then we have to put that together with a statement that the EU Council President, a guy named Charles Michel, put out in mid-May, that indicated that apparently a breakthrough was reached on this point, on what Baku calls the Zangezur corridor, right? This part that goes through a slice of Armenia. Now, and you know, maybe a breakthrough has been achieved. That statement was put out in May. We're now in almost mid-July, but let's see. Sooner or later, it will be completed. Sooner or later, we will have this corridor. And upon completion, it will become the most direct transportation corridor from Anatolia to Central Asia. And this is potentially a huge development. And its importance has further increased since February 24th. Okay, so you've got Maersk recently launching its first overland shipping route from China to the EU via the Silk Road region, via the so-called middle corridor route that, you know, doesn't go through Russia and then doesn't go through the southern route or even in a maritime way, right? And this has started to happen now even without an agreement on the Zangezur corridor, which would cut transportation costs further. Consequence number 4. The end of the Second Karabakh War marked a geopolitical sea change that few have noticed. Pay attention. It's the first time ever that troops not belonging to Russia are deployed in the South Caucasus with Russia's explicit consent, which has had for 2 centuries a complete monopoly on this matter in the South Caucasus. Now, I'm referring to the Turkish troops that exist in a very close to this Russian peacekeeping zone in a part of Karabakh. But it's more important than that if you think through the principle that's involved. Okay, and that brings me to geopolitical consequence number 5. We can now say that the South Caucasus is truly geopolitically heterogeneous. Now, this in turn implies that the strength of Russia's sphere of influence has been diluted, at least somewhat. And this was before Ukraine, right? So this was in November 2020. Now, to the Kremlin's credit, it has embraced this paradigm shift with grace, even managing to secure leverageable tactical gains in the process. And it hasn't even tried too hard to put a stop to the EU's facilitation or mediation, whatever you want to call it, of the consequent peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, of course, one reason that Russia hasn't done this is that it has got its hands tied up in Ukraine and in preventing a domestic economic disaster and all that. But I would argue that that's actually not the main reason. Russia knows that reestablishing transport links will cost a lot of money, and it has little interest in serving as the principal donor or investor. And my point is that I think that this was clearly the Kremlin's position even before February of this year. Okay, so that's Russia. Now, Iran. Iran reacted less gracefully to this paradigm shift, the shift that made the South Caucasus truly geopolitically heterogeneous. And I think part of the reason has to do with the fact that its legitimate interests were not taken into account at war's end. Tehran was not privy to the Moscow-mediated document that ended the conflict over Karabakh. And it obviously doesn't like NATO member Turkey enhancing its presence in the region, whether it's military or economic or political, whatever. But most of the Iranian objections have been addressed and practically reduced, thanks to deft Azerbaijani diplomacy that I can talk about later. But also because Tehran is trying to play nice in the context of the talks with the West over the nuclear deal, which may or may not be dying a slow death. We'll see soon enough. I want to underline that what has been agreed so far in the context of the sort of the end of the conflict over Karabakh and then the peace process that is ongoing, but the focus on sort of, connectivity and transport links and reviving all these things. These are just the first steps. Deriving from this heightened geopolitical heterogeneity is consequence number 6, geopolitical consequence number 6. The concept of a 3+3 format for regional cooperation and connectivity. And I want to emphasize concept or idea and not an actual institutional proposal. Now, the gist of 3+3, and I think I'm going to be able to explain this quickly. The gist of 3+3 is to build upon the terms and the underlying logic of this November 2020 Moscow brokered agreement that ended the war, such that Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia enter into an arrangement with Iran, Russia, and Turkey to cooperate on, at the very least, economic issues affecting that part of the Silk Road region. Okay, so obviously there are various impediments to realizing some version of this idea in practice, right? Again, not necessarily the concrete proposal to create an institution, that's probably not going to happen, but the idea. Georgia is understandably reticent, but I think, at least conceptually, they're ultimately overcomable, even though Russia's weakening geoeconomic position has muddied the water further. But I think that on balance, the impediments are more tactical than strategic. And I'll just give you an example on Georgia, because the other objections to this are easier to deal with, but the Georgian one obviously is the most important. You look at bilateral trade numbers between Georgia and Russia, they're on the upswing. As of early June 2022, Russian citizens can now again cross unimpeded by Georgia into Georgia by car. and it looks like direct flights are being restored. So, given the limited holiday options for Russian citizens, this means that Georgia could rake in a couple of $1 billion from Russian tourists. And if you think that sounds crazy, because, Georgia, Russia, there's a territorial issue. In 2019, so the year before COVID, Russian tourists spent the total amount, these are Georgian numbers. I can't remember if it was $2 or $3 billion. It's a lot of money for Georgia. Okay. Anyway, the EU's choice not to accept Georgia's application for accession talks, at this time at least, also speaks to this point, right? There are enough random variables in this 3+3 equation in the context of Georgia that seem to indicate that one way or another 3+3 is going to work, at least as an idea, if not as an institution. Okay, so we can derive four things from the geopolitical and geoeconomic logic informing 3+3. Okay, and pay attention because it's important for the overall argument. First, right now, there are no plans to incorporate a Western presence in the 3+3 concept. Two, 3+3 would maintain a strong Russian presence while further entrenching Turkey's growing influence in the South Caucasus. The third sort of thing that we can notice is that the 3+3 format would also bring Iran back into the regional fold. After more than 2 centuries of basically being excluded in the wake of losing 2 wars in quick succession to the Russians at the time of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, right? So it's a way to compensate Iran and to regularize the Turkish gains. And then the fourth thing that we can notice is that the consequence of the EU coming in back into for the first time into the peace process as a facilitator, peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan, is mostly going to be financial. This is going to be the main consequence, paying for connectivity. And this, of course, will have economic and commercial benefits for everyone, including the EU, obviously. But it seems unlikely that the EU is going to expand its values-based political sphere of interest at much expense to other players in the context of the Second Karabakh War, or anywhere else for that matter, when it comes to the Silk Road region. Okay, you see this? So now we come to geopolitical consequence number 7. The prospect has never been greater for establishing a formal peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but also between Armenia and Turkey. So I'm going to skip over the details. We can talk a lot about this later if you'd like, or I'd be curious what Dr. Cutler may wish to say about this. But let me just have that in just plant it there as an important seed, right? The prospect for peace has never been greater. Let me go back to the other main part of the Silk Road region, Central Asia, with geopolitical consequence number 8. Central Asia, including Afghanistan, has also been making great strides towards institutionalizing regional economic connectivity. Okay? The scale and scope of the plans now being laid out call to mind older arrangements in other geographies. ASEAN, the Nordic Council, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the original European Economic Community. Okay, they call to mind. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. Now, in Central Asia, integration efforts began in the 1990s, thanks to the endeavors of Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was Kazakhstan's founding father. But the geopolitical timing was off. It came too early. And presumably you all know that Nazarbayev had this unconstructive rivalry with Uzbekistan's Islam Karimov. But even in such circumstances, in the 1990s, we could see the embryonic steps towards regional cooperation. All right. By the time we get into the 21st century, we have a good example of the establishment of the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone. This is the official title of the thing. The text was agreed in September 2006. Treaty came into effect in March 2009. Now it's significant because it's the first regional agreement ever that did not include any power from outside Central Asia as a signatory. Okay, but things really got off the ground in Central Asia only when Karimov died in 2016. And that's when his successor, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, came to power again in Uzbekistan. And this is where we see the beginnings of what remains an ongoing text-based process of Central Asian economic connectivity and regionalization. Let me just take you through some of the greatest hits of this process. We had a testing of the water summit that happened in November 2017 in Samarkand. Then we had something called a consultative meeting of the heads of state of Central Asia that was held in Astana in March 2018. But the president of Turkmenistan didn't show up. Famously, he chose to make a state visit to Kuwait. Then you had another meeting of this consultative meeting of the heads of state, took place in Tashkent in November 2019. Then we had the COVID break, and then another one took place in August last year in Turkmenbashi. And obviously, the Turkmen president was there. And then it looks like this has now been made official on July 21st of this year in a resort town in Kyrgyzstan that's located on the northern shore of Lake Issyk-Kul, which is just below Almaty, if you can picture this in your head. Anyway, the next meeting of the heads of state of Central Asia is going to take place there in July, on July 21st. And it's expected that a formal treaty of institutionalized cooperation is going to be placed before the presidents for signature, assuming that their foreign ministers can finalize the text by then, and it looks like that's going in the right direction. Now, this document could be far-reaching. We don't know, nobody's seen the text, it hasn't leaked because it's Central Asia, things don't leak. But I think that it looks like it's going to be called an agreement on friendship, good neighborliness, and cooperation for the development of Central Asia in the 21st century. A very long title, but what can we observe from all of this activity? Well, economic integration proposals have gained a new impetus on both sides of the Caspian, right? Remember, I talked about the concept of 3+3 and then all this stuff that's happening in Central Asia that we just went through. And that's not all. A moment prior to the 2021 Central Asian Summit that was hosted by Turkmenistan, there was this unprecedented major international conference promoting economic connectivity between Central Asia and South Asia that took place in Tashkent in July 2021, right? And you should remember this, you in the audience who are Indian particularly should remember this because it really was a big deal, right? Central Asia, South Asia connectivity, Tashkent. Now think of the calendar. The timing. The Tashkent conference took place 3 months after the Americans announced that they would withdraw from Afghanistan. And the point is that in Central Asia, talks regarding regional connectivity in both narrower and broader formats, they've continued, right? The Taliban takeover of Afghanistan haven't stalled the momentum of such talks. And a major reason is that pretty much every country that matters in the Silk Road region has had senior level contacts with the Taliban for years. Now, this brings me to geopolitical consequence number 9. Pretty much every country in the neighborhood has been making contingency plans to deal with the possibility of a Taliban takeover. No one in the region seriously assumed that the Americans would stay in Afghanistan for as long as they have in, Germany or Japan or South Korea. And basically, no one waited until the Taliban to take over again to establish senior level contacts with them. The point here is that as a whole, the Silk Road region has it had enough of the sophisticated wherewithal of statecraft to adapt quickly. And then this brings me to the 10th and the final major consequence that I wanted to list and discuss and sort of as a way to set the stage, right? And here it is. Geopolitical and security and economic integration developments on either side of the Caspian are being driven by those belonging to the region itself. Okay? Now, this is important. Nothing that's happened on either side of the Caspian is predicated on the embrace of contemporary Western preferences in governance models, for instance. Also, these processes very purposefully exclude full Western participation. And I'll bet you that they will exclude full Western membership too, when we get to that point. Just like all the current Silk Road region arrangements do, okay? Turkic Council is one example. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another one. Now, of course, the audience is mainly Indian, so you know how the SCO has its challenges. but if it can overcome present limitations on its effectiveness, the SCO can really grow in stature and importance in the context of what I'm talking about today. Why is that? Well, just look at the list of its member states, observer states, and dialogue partners. And what do you see? All of the major non-Western players in the Silk Road region, all of them participate in the work of the SCO. And this is a unique advantage. It's the only institution that can make that claim. Now, I've got to make two more observations on this. First, the unspoken shadow being cast across the Silk Road region, obviously, is the China-led Belt and Road Initiative. Okay? Now, whatever else you can say about Belt and Road, it would be hard to deny that it's at least partially about building infrastructure and building economies to one another in a region eager to catch up. So in other words, what does the Belt and Road offer? It augurs some form of globalization without the controversial tenets of the Washington Consensus. And that's quite an attractive proposition for just about every country belonging to the Silk Road region. And I'll get into this a bit more in a few minutes when I describe what I'd like to call Silk Road values. But stay with me for the moment. My last observation is that we have the whole energy issue obviously rising in importance, right? Which is a consequence of the Western-led sanctions against Russia. And we can talk about energy forever, and Dr. Cutler is a much more serious authority on this than I am. So I will only say this about energy. Basically, if just one hurdle can be overcome, and it's an important one, but it's still just one hurdle, Turkmenistani hydrocarbons could flow towards Europe via a Caspian interconnector in the next year. Now, this would be a first. And you already see a sort of soft version of this that's already happening. You have this agreement that was made very recently on a triangular gas swap between Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkmenistan. And again, Dr. Cutler knows a lot more about this than I do. But the point is that notwithstanding pressures on Turkmenistan not to do this, at least a soft version of it is actually happening. And that may result in an interconnector. And if that happens, then that is further evidence of the argument that I'm trying to make. Also, by the way, Azerbaijan is already increasing export capacity to Europe, thanks to rising demand due to this Ukrainian bedlam. And I think we're probably going to see various existing pipelines being expanded in the time ahead, which is something that until very, very recently would have been almost impossible to imagine for reasons that have to do with the greening of the economy and sustainable development and all that business. Okay? So there you have it. That's my list of top 10 geopolitical consequences resulting from the Second Karabakh War, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the weakening of Russia since February 24th. And altogether, these have significantly affected the balance of power in the Silk Road region. This is my bottom line, okay? And we can sum up these geopolitical consequences in the following way. Regionally driven economic connectivity is on the way in. Outside power agenda setting is on the way out. And some outsiders are seeing the relative power decline. Others are seeing an increase. But in the aggregate, the power of outsiders is being reduced overall. This is verbatim a paragraph that I've already read at the beginning of the lecture, but it's so important that you get what my bottom line is, because you can get lost in the weeds with all this 3 events, top 10 geopolitical consequence, all that. So this is why I'm repeating it again, okay? So that's the first major point that I wanted to make this afternoon. The second main point that I want to make today is that and that requires me to take you back to Brzezinski again, okay? Remember, he's the one who popularized the metaphor of the grand chessboard in the 1990s. Now, this image went on to frame mainstream geopolitical thinking about the Silk Road region in the post-Cold War world. And my argument, as I've said already, is that it's outdated and flawed and just plain wrong. And I'd like to propose its replacement, that of a card table. So please picture, if you will, a room with a card table. You know, a table where you play cards like poker. So various players are staying in their chairs. Some are retaking their seats after a break. Others are coming through the door of the room in which the card table finds itself. They're coming through this door for the first time. A few just decided to get up from their chairs, but seem to want to remain in the room. And all the while, the deck is being reshuffled and new cards will soon be dealt. Okay? Now, an evident conceptual advantage to seeing the Silk Road region as a card table is that there can be more than two players. And this is obviously not the case with chess, right? And Brzezinski was obviously aware of this, but still it's his metaphor. And its unavoidable implication is that in the Brzezinski world, you've got the White House and the Kremlin as the region's only truly independent players. They and they alone controlled the board, the movement of the pieces, and the formulation of strategies. But that's not how it works at a card table. There's plenty of room for more chairs to be added without disrupting the general flow of play. New players can join, old ones can fall by the wayside, anyone can pretty much cash out at any time. Now, a further problem with the Brzezinski metaphor is that chess involves no hidden information. Calculating the odds and thinking ahead is important to both chess and cards, but at a card table, the ability to bluff effectively is an integral part of the game. So, by the way, is making sure a player can conceal his or her tell while trying to uncover the respective tells of the other players. The tell is the facial tick or whatever that you make when you have a good hand and you're pretending not to. But it's important to be able to recognize that. It's also important not to be able to conceal your own, right? That's an incredibly important part of card play, and that simply doesn't exist in chess conceptually, no equivalent. And in chess, moreover, moving is compulsory. No player can skip a turn, even when doing so is detrimental to his or her position. Now, in contrast, in some of the more complex card games like poker, they don't have this requirement, right? Players can check. They can essentially choose not to make a move or draw a card or whatever. Now, this adds layers of subtlety and complexity that correspond more closely, I think, to the reality of geopolitics. And of course, at a card table, depending on the game, other players and even spectators can stake fellow players, right? The term of art in poker is staking. And if you've read Ian Fleming's Casino Royale, or if you've seen the movie, you know how staking works. Furthermore, there are disparities in stack sizes amongst the players seated around a card table, right? And that matters. And this also changes over time, with real consequences affecting players' subsequent strategies. And I should also mention that at a card table, starting hands are never dealt even, right? We all know the expression to play the hand you're dealt. So in other words, equality of opportunity and notions of fairness and transparency and all that are not concepts that can be effectively executed by players seated at a card table. There should be some resonance with the way geopolitics has always been and is today. Now, before moving on, I want to re-emphasize the inclusivity principle that lies at the heart of the card table metaphor, right? It's not just about Moscow and Washington. You've got Nur Sultan, you've got Tashkent, you've got Baku can take their seats. So can Delhi and Tehran and Ankara and Beijing and Brussels and Berlin, Paris, London. Why not? Islamabad too, Kabul also, and so on. Right? The overall point of my card table metaphor is actually quite simple, right? Essentially, if you have what it takes, or if you think you do, you can pull up a chair, take a seat at the card table, and partake in the great game. And if you don't, you can pack it up, even walk out of the room. And if your fortune changes and circumstances allow, you can be dealt back in. But regardless, the great game goes on. Okay? Now, this brings me to my third and final main point that I want to make to you this afternoon or this evening. And it builds on the first two, and it ultimately has to do with independent agency, free will, we used to call this, and what derives as geopolitical motivators from free will, from independent agency. You know, fear, honor, interest, to use the famous Thucydidean triad. look, the metaphor of the grand chessboard presupposes that the Silk Road region was, is, and will remain an object of great power relations. Well, my metaphor of the card table works better because the Silk Road region is becoming, I think, a fully fledged, distinct, and emancipated subject of the international order. Okay? Now, in other words, the metaphor of the card table accepts the possibility of the autonomous geopolitical development of the states that geographically belong to the region itself. And this conforms to the overarching geopolitical reality we see in the Silk Road region today. A whole possibly greater than the present sum of the Silk Road region's emerging set of initiatives and institutions. Now, that geopolitical reality is characterized by the fact that its leading states are all middle powers. So Giovanni Botero, he's the Italian thinker who coined the term centuries ago. Botero defined middle powers as states that have, I'm quoting, sufficient force and authority to stand on their own without the need of help from others. So in Botero's telling, leaders of middle powers tend to be acutely aware of the dexterity required to maintain security and project influence in a prudential manner beyond their immediate borders. And because of that, middle powers are apt to have facility in promoting trade and connectivity with their neighbors and their neighbors' neighbors. Okay? Now, unquestionably, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan are such middle powers or keystone states. This is a term that Nicholas Gvozdev from the US Naval War College has come up with, and he's written about it in various places, and some of these have been co-authored with me. Now, the way Gvozdev and I see it, keystone states are trusted interlocutors, reliable intermediaries, and critical mediators that can act as buffers between major power centers. Okay? And keystone states are the anchors of the Silk Road region. Now, none by itself is indispensable, but together they provide equilibrium while setting the tone and the pace and the scope of the overall cooperation agenda. Okay? External powers exert some influence, obviously, but developments in the Silk Road region are unlikely to keep being decisively driven, much less determined, by the oftentimes clashing agendas and preferences and objectives and priorities of the great powers. So let me give you just one example before moving on. Kazakhstan's reticence towards Russian requests, let's say, to repay the favor, as it were, by sending troops to the Ukrainian front after the Kremlin effectually saved Tokayev's regime in January of this year, okay? Kazakhstan is a famous case study. Just in case you need a refresher, it's worth it to go into the details of this. The current president of Kazakhstan, his surname is Tokayev. So Tokayev was the originator of Kazakhstan's multi-vectoralist foreign policy posture, right? And this dates back to the turn of the century, the period in which Tokayev served as Kazakhstan's prime minister and entrenched his position as Nazarbayev's chief geostrategist. Okay, and then, so that's the background. Now, so what does Tokayev do? He shows up in mid-June 2022 at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, more or less as Putin's keynote foreign guest, when not a lot of other foreigners were coming, obviously, because of the sanctions and the perception and all that stuff. So he shows up. And in some ways, his speech was a masterclass in geopolitical timing and messaging. And in some ways, it wasn't. But the point is that such errors are rare. And well, there are consequences to overplaying your hand at the card table. There's an expression to be too clever by half that rises to the mind, right? Now, all right, well, that was the illustration via Kazakhstan. But to repeat, one characteristic of the Silk Road region is that it's anchored by keystone states sitting around the card table along with other players. And its keystone states are Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And all three are committed to building a region with more partners and fewer enemies. A second characteristic of the Silk Road region is that these Keystone States embrace elements of both strategic autonomy and strategic restraint. This is called a soft balancing approach, to borrow from Professor T.V. Paul. He's an Indian-born scholar of international relations who teaches at McGill University in Montreal. Okay, so that's the second characteristic. A third characteristic of the Silk Road region is the salience of a 21st century version of what in the 1990s was called Asian values. All right, I'm looking at the clock, so I won't explain the background to what Asian values was in the 1990s, but those of you who remember the concept will understand what I'm trying to say. And I don't want to provide a full typology of these Silk Road region values, but 4 traits can help understand or illustrate this underappreciated phenomenon. Okay, 1, Silk Road region values are more compatible with respecting the universal principles of international law than what is called by its proponents a rules-based liberal international order. And I can explain this distinction, this critical distinction in detail later in our time together if you'd like. But that's one aspect of the Silk Road region values typology. The second is that Silk Road region values are broadly suspicious of outsiders placing soft law-driven limitations on national sovereignty, right? Like the narrowing of the scope of the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of states, or like being penalized for not enforcing sanctions that haven't been ratified by the UN Security Council, right? My audience is mainly Indian, so you understand this. Trait number 3, Silk Road region values prioritize allegiance to a strong state with an economically interventionist government. Okay, now the logic here is that a weak state more easily produces a failed state. And a weak state also allows foreign capital to leverage economic decision-making, which then necessarily limits the scope of governmental power, right? Now, this also explains the increasing emphasis on meritocratic governance, I think, in the Silk Road region. Let's put this euphemistically, the downplaying of liberal democratic norms and values, okay? And trait number 4, Silk Road values generally downplay ethnic and even civic nationalism in favor of what Anatol Lieven calls state nationalism, right? Fidelity to the state as embodied by loyalty to its leadership. And this is, in fact, quite a traditional form of political identity, right? It goes back to Xerxes and Alexander the Great and people like that, right? History's embryonic attempts to bring order to the core of the Silk Road region. Now, I'm almost done. And it's really important to understand this. Everything that I've discussed today is all the more consequential given that the Silk Road region as a whole is becoming an increasingly important geopolitical theater. Certainly, its global importance today is greater than it has been in centuries. And that's not going to change. So if there's one takeaway that I'd like you to remember from this evening session, it's this. The Silk Road region, the Keystone States of the Silk Road region are attempting to establish their own set of initiatives and institutions. And this burgeoning posture represents a surge of interdependence and a surge of connectivity and a surge of integration. And all this may very well result in the construction of a genuinely stable and lasting regional order, right? A regional order that advances, first and foremost, the interests and the values of the region, by the region, for the region, to borrow a Lincolnian turn of phrase. That's another reason why all of this is so important. And you know what? The likelihood of success seems higher today than it did yesterday or the day before. And I want to give you 2 simple Kissingerian reasons why. First, maintaining the balance of power in any geopolitical order, especially in a regional one, is predicated on all the players commonly acknowledging weakness. Each anchor power concedes it can't dominate others, and each determines it's better off not trying to do so, right? The Kissingerian phrase here is states of substantially equal strength, Now, the second point derives from the first, and it's also a critical one. Every stable and lasting balance of power system in history, every one, has been predicated on a shared state of mind, a common worldview, as much as anything else. Now, think of it. Common fidelity to Silk Road values could be the special ingredient of the secret sauce that binds firmly and brings closer together the countries of the Silk Road region in the time ahead. So my bottom line takeaway is this: don't bet against the Silk Road region, and don't bet against its Keystone States, because they know what they're doing, they've got it together, their statecraft is solid, and let me tell you, they really understand the emerging realities of geopolitics. All right, now, remember please, at the beginning of today's event, I said I wanted to make 3 basic points. I want to go over them again, just to make sure we understand what we've been doing now over the last, whatever it is, half an hour. 1, the balance of power in the Silk Road region is not just shifting, but it's transforming. And I gave you 3 main events accelerating this strategic trend and a top 10 list of its geopolitical consequences. My basic conclusion was that the cumulative effect of all this can be summarized in the following manner. Regionally driven economic connectivity is on the way in. Outside power agenda setting is on the way out. You got some outsiders seeing their relative power decline. Others are seeing an increase. But in the aggregate, the power of outsiders is being reduced overall. That was point number 1. Point number 2 was that Brzezinski's grand chessboard metaphor that for a long time has framed geopolitical thinking about the Silk Road region is outdated and flawed and wrong. And I proposed and explained its replacement, the card table. And then point number 3, which derives from the first 2, was that the Silk Road region it's not merely an object of great power relations. It's on the cusp of becoming a distinct and autonomous and emancipated subject of international order. And I came to this assessment by examining the Silk Road region's emerging set of initiatives and institutions that, when you take them together, may herald the onset of a stable and lasting order. And I hope that I've accomplished these 3 things this evening with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Damjan Krnjević Mišković, for an insightful and erudite special lecture. It was indeed very interesting and detailed. Especially would like to acknowledge the guidance and encouragement and support of Mr. Soham Das, Chairperson and Director, Tillotoma Foundation. I am glad to have Professor Robert M. Cutler, Associate Director, Canada Office, Tillotoma Foundation, as a discussant.
I want to thank Damjan for his magisterial exposition, to which I shall attempt to do justice in the 15 to 20 minutes. I will agree with the great deal of what you said, Damjan, and I will offer nuances on other parts of it. But to make things interesting for ourselves and the audience, I would like to begin with an acute disagreement on a very minor point, but which I shall then nuance to the point where you will find it to be entirely unobjectionable. I did not invent that rhetorical device myself, but rather I learned it at a distance. I understand that Milton Friedman did this very often. So I am taking that device. I'm going to interject an acute disagreement and then nuance. I appreciated being my first university degree in history, your background to the idea of Eurasia, but I should like to suggest, Damjan, that the idea of a Silk Road region is just as ethnocentric as any other. In fact, one can say it's doubly ethnocentric. First of all, if we talk about silk, this is obviously a Chinese notion, and the Silk Road is often still called in China the Jade Road, from the jade trade, as you know, which still exists, although the Silk Road, the silk was traded further west than jade. So the whole Silk Road risks, as an idea, being Sinocentric, not to, as you yourself mentioned, the road aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative. But when was the first popularization of the term Silk Road? Why, it was by German geopoliticians, and you're nodding your head, you know this, that Ferdinand von Richthofen used the term Seidenstrasse, but it had been current in Germany from the late 1850s at least. And the first book that had the term Silk Road in its title was written by a Swedish geographer in the late 1930s. And lo and behold, the Silk Road Studies Program Joint Center that you and I both know and like very well is run where? Out of Stockholm by a Swedish political scientist, built upon the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, built in Washington in the 1990s, 2000s by an American political scientist. So I just throw that out there as a bone for discussion, that Silk Road may appear to be less culturally laden a term than Eurasia, but I'm going to suggest, and I'm going to say why my subjectivity impels me to suggest, and I'm going to offer what I hope are objective reasons why certain variations on the term of Eurasia may also be at least as acceptable, if not more descriptive and analytically useful. Now, 20 years ago, I was on the first or second executive committee of the Central Eurasian Studies Society. And there was a definition of Eurasia on their website, which is no longer available, unfortunately. Or I'm sorry, the definition of not Eurasia, but Central Eurasia on their website, which is no longer available, but I retain it because I've cited it, and I still find it very descriptive. And I offer it to you so that you can tell me in reply after I finished, how well does it coincide with what you mean by the Silk Road? So I don't know. So Central Eurasia, as it was used at the time, and I quote, includes Turkic, Mongolian, Iranian, Caucasian, Tibetan, and other peoples, and extends from the Black Sea region, the Crimea and Caucasus in the west, through the Middle Volga region, Central Asia and Afghanistan, onto Siberia, Mongolia, including what used to be called Inner Mongolia, and Tibet in the east. So if ever, I'm not going to use the term Silk Road Institute, Silk Road, because I'm not used to it, please forgive me, but I'm not going to say very much about Central Eurasia, except maybe toward the end when I come back to it. But that's what my background leads me to use that. And I'm going to foreshadow the conclusion by saying, at least from a geoeconomic point of view, which, as you know, is the point of view that I take, which is based principally, but not exclusively, in energy, that we can now today see an emergence of East Central Eurasia and West Central Eurasia, which are rather geographically relatively well defined, and which could be united not by Keystone States, but by a Keystone Triangle of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan. So you see that there's an overlap in our views of things, and I will invite you in reply to comment on my comments. Now, your three main points in the beginning about how the region has changed, these are indisputable. As to the 10 consequences, I'm largely in agreement. I'd like to rearrange them slightly and summarize them to remind the audience, and then go further. You mentioned, I would say that these 10 elements can be summarized under 5 headings. The first and the second of conflict mediation and geopolitical consequence, and so on. This is the global level. What I would call the Central Eurasian level, in fact, includes what you called this third and the seventh points, which are the geopolitical consequence of the end of the Second Karabakh War. And also, number 7 was also about the Karabakh War in South Caucasus and Turco-Caucasia. So I would put those together as a Central Eurasian level. Then nesting further within that, I would mention the South Caucasus level, where your points 4, 5, and 6 would fall in this scheme of their reorganization. Again, the Second Karabakh War, the heterogeneity of the South Caucasus. The one quibble I would have, but I would not say personally Russia's explicit consent that the Turkish troops are there, because they didn't have a choice. real, and you know that, basically Azerbaijan invited them. So with their consent, but not their explicit consent, because they weren't really asked. And if you look at the history, the diplomatic history, they weren't asked. They were just presented with a fait accompli, a declaration, and then the presence by Azerbaijan, and then the Turkish troops being present, which, as you know, and as you pointed out, they are not actually even in the territory currently outside the control of the Baku authorities and occupied by the Russian so-called peacekeepers. They're adjacent to that, even if they do make signs of cooperating with the Russians. And third, the 3+3 format also falls into this South Caucasus level of the reorganization of your points. And I guess this would be the point for me to say that there are two things that I would first, I'm less hopeful about the 3+3 than you are as a format, as a platform, because as you know, sitting in Baku, Iran has not stopped, or parts of the Iranian state apparatus have not stopped trying to replace the secular Azerbaijani regime with a client theocracy. Georgia will not sit at the same table with Russia, and so on. And actually, as you probably know, the idea of this 3+3 goes back to CEP's the Center for European Policy Studies. About 20 years ago, Michael Emerson's initiative, in which I participated in the working group for a stability pact, as he called it. First for the Caucasus, and then he limited it to the South Caucasus. And there were a number of declarations at the time in favor of this, Demirel, other people, but it didn't get off the ground. And for whatever reasons, I believe that it still has some problems, not least of which is that not all 6 putative participants have incentive structures that motivate them to adopt a 3+3 format rather than a 1+1 format. Why not do things bilaterally? In case of Russia, trilaterally with Armenia, Azerbaijan. I just see a problem there. And I didn't intend to say this, but it comes to me. I see the same problem with any further evolution of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's not an organization without significance, but I think you will agree that it's really a platform for deputy ministers and prime ministers to get together and to figure out how to cooperate in other more limited forms. It's not going to be an international organization the way that Europeans have international organizations. So that having been said, then your points 8 and 9 bring in Afghanistan, no dispute there. And then point 10 is the autonomy of the Silk Road here. This is I think you would agree, it's your most significant point, and I fully agree with it from the standpoint of complex systems on which I've spent a good deal of work. This is called autopoiesis, which means literally self-creation. It means being able to throw out, project out from your own existence those goals autonomously defined and not imposed on you by others that you wish to pursue in future. This happens to us when we go to graduate school. It happens to people when they choose careers. It happens to countries in the Silk Road or Central Eurasia, as you mentioned. I believe that this is, although I hold out, I will say that my other work on complex system leads me to foresee the disintegration of the current international system in the early to mid 2040s. And therefore they don't have all the time in the world if they're going to create something that's going to have a chance to see them through the dozen years of chaos until the next international system begins to take shape in the mid and the late 2050s. But that's another story for another talk. Let's see, I'm coming to the limit of my remarks. I'll just mention I'm In case anyone wants to ask, or you want to ask, or we talk about it later, I'm a bit more skeptical about the Caspian interconnector. That's the small pipeline that's been talked about for 15 years. That's not going to happen. And I can say in 25 words or less why it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for the same reason it happened for the last 25 years, for the last 15 years, because whatever Turkmenistan does in the Caspian is going to annoy the Russians. They're not going to annoy the Russians for 8 to 10 billion cubic meters a year and some beautifully sounding promises for more. No, they're going to insist on dotted line commitments to 31 billion cubic meters a year, or it's not worth annoying the Russians. Simple as that. And that's why it hasn't happened in the past. And there are business models, so then one gets into the question of business models. They do exist. They're a little more difficult. Anyway, that's, again, yet another subject. I just throw that out there as a tantalizing hors d'oeuvre to another topic. I already mentioned the Keystone Triangle, the Keystone States. Undoubtedly, we know that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are the drivers. Uzbekistan more a potential driver of Central Asian prosperity than Turkmenistan can be. Uzbekistan population, energy production, gross national product, and so on. Yet Uzbekistan is not a Caspian littoral state, which does not disqualify it from being a Keystone state, but it does disqualify it from being a member of the Trans-Caspian Triangle. Now, one of the things that complex systems allows you to do is to build from triangles into quadrilaterals, from quadrilaterals into pentangles. So one can certainly, and I have maps, which I'm not inflicting on you, that suggest this, so that Uzbekistan is by no means included and no means excluded from this. It would be wrong to exclude Uzbekistan from consideration here, but it's a question of the angle from which, or the under which one wishes to consider it. Now, as to the four values, here I do have a substantive rather than a passing suggestion. It seems to me that these are not universal of the Silk Road countries, however you define them, and that they are, I think you're sitting in Baku, Damjan, and you are universalizing and projecting the Azerbaijani approach onto all Silk Road countries, which is understandable, but and you can do it aspirationally, but I believe that it's necessary to see that this may be a shortcoming in the analysis. International law, it's easy to point out outliers in the Silk Road region to the appreciation of international law. Pakistan, Armenia, Iran, Russia, China, regarding international humanitarian law. I mean, regarding the law against the use of force or the threat of the use of force. I mean, and so it's a very selective way of these values. Suspiciousness of limitations on external sovereignty. Okay, that we can that goes along with number one, and values number 3 and 4 go together. The allegiance to a strong state with economic interventionist government. I raise a question mark over Anatol Lieven's notion of state nationalism. I go so far as to agitate that this is an Orientalist projection, which in the Western journalism on Central Asia comes under the guise of, oh, Berdy Muhammadov, he's just a figure of fun. Mirziyoyev, he's just a new Karimov. And Tokayev, he's just, an Oriental despot. And he doesn't even deserve a chance to implement democratic norms over 10 or 20 years, which it would take anyway, because, we just shouldn't take him seriously. I exaggerate, but only slightly. I mean, I was very skeptical, dismissive of Edward Said's thesis about Orientalism until I started reading the Western journalism on Central Asia. And there's something to it. So I think that what Lieven calls state nationalism may be just a fig leaf. Consciously or unconsciously, he's covering over this strongman mentality. And one can point even two countries in the region, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, that maybe they have strong leaders, but they're also highly civic nationalist. They're pluralists. They're respective of other ethnic, of their domestic ethnic groups. They're multicultural. So I encourage you to rethink the adoption of Anatol Lieven's moniker of state nationalism, which I think does not do justice to the open-mindedness of at least some Silk Road region, not just leaders, but their societies and their cultures. And that's what I have to say about that. Now to conclude, your card game table. I would elaborate that in the following, while agreeing with it, I would elaborate in the following way. Back in the late 90s, when I started studying energy in the early 2000s, I have to agree with you because I used the metaphor of a poker game. I'm not saying you stole it from me because great minds think alike, and we're not the only two who've used it. But it seems to me that this poker game had, over time, transformed first into where the players on the poker game are pieces on a chessboard. And you have chess players, and there's a multi-dimension, not just two chess players like Star Trek chess, you know, and not only that, but you have old, Oxacals, who are hiding their rooks, under their beards, and then they move it and say, aha, now I can take your queen, and so it's multi-dimensional chessboard. But then at least from the energy standpoint, this transformed into a stock market. You had market makers, you had actual projects, you had contracts, you had market makers for energy pipelines. I'm not saying this is transferable to the geopolitical analysis at large, but this is what I found. And then now, under your inspiration, I've come to realize that the chessboard, became embedded in the stock market, as it were. I mean, the chess players took sides on in the stock market. Some of them had larger stakes. Some of them didn't have stakes, but they were managers, of the energy projects. Now, the stock market now seems to have transmogrified into a bridge game, or canasta, which is not so well known, but in the 1950s to the 1960s, canasta was a variation on bridge invented by two, I think they were Uruguayans, if I'm not mistaken, and became very popular in South and North America in the 1950s and the 1960s. And it's a fork, as we would say now in software language, it's a fork of bridge. And so I would say that you just didn't go far enough. It's a card table, but there's a lot more to it. Now, come back to Central Eurasia. I conclude that first on 2 points, the second of which is a re-agreement with your major point. The first of which is my nuance to introduce a Central Eurasia in place of Silk Road, because that enables the distinction between East Central Eurasia and West Central Eurasia, which I can show you very well on a pipeline map. It's fascinating because they didn't used to exist in the 1990s, like 20 years ago. What you had was, on one hand, Turco-Caucasia and Central Asia. These grew into Greater Turco-Caucasia and Greater Central Asia, for which there are unique definitions, by the way, which I'm not inflicting on you. And then finally, we have these with the proliferation of the networks and the growth of the networks, energy and economic. We have East Central Eurasia and West Central Eurasia, divided by what? The Caspian Sea. And this is where I come back. This is why I have a fondness for the Keystone Triangle, Trans-Caspian, in addition to, along with the Keystone States, because from an economic and from a standpoint of domestic economic strength, one cannot say that Turkmenistan is a keystone country in the way that Uzbekistan is. However, it's an important geoeconomic, geopolitical player, so that's why I do that. Now, finally, to conclude and to repeat your main point, which is that, yes, this is all based, by the way, I didn't give you the theoretical apparatus to all this, but this is all growing out of my work in the application of the theory of complex systems. What's a complex system? It's exactly what you mean, Damjan. A complex system is a system the behavior of which cannot be predicted by the examination of the behavior of its parts. And that's what you mean by central, when you're talking about the Silk Road. That's one of the things that you mean. And it's, I mentioned the word autopoiesis. Just for sake of comparison, your canonical non-complex system is an automobile factory. You can see what goes in, you can examine how it's transformed, and you can predict what's going to come out. People aren't that way, international systems aren't that way, countries aren't that way, institutions aren't that way. So I want to conclude on the point of our greatest agreement and stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I'm always glad to, this is something that Cutler and I will understand and the rest of you won't, but it's worth repeating. He and I had a very long and fruitful conversation several months ago that went on past when it should have, and judging by the clock. And it occurred to me that what we've done this afternoon or this evening or this morning, depending on where we are, is almost, you know, a literal continuation of where we stopped last time. So that's, I'm very happy to have that opportunity to have this kind of continuation of a conversation in different formats. So fine, I will grant to you in accordance with the Friedman-esque understanding of you know, a major disagreement. Yeah, fine. I grant, but I would explain this, or I would justify my choice in the following way. The term Eurasia is much more directly and obviously imperialistic. So even though the term Silk Road region or some variation thereof is also a Western neologism. It's a Western neologism by that comes out a little earlier, but notwithstanding the timeline, it's also a Western neologism, but it's not one that immediately has imperial connotations. So I grant your point on the Sinocentricity, but on the other hand, the geographic aspect of this that happens to correspond to the definition that you read from 20 years ago, more or less corresponds to it, has the advantage of not having that immediate imperial connotation. And the reason that it's important in the context of what I'm trying to think through, and the reason that I choose it is not just to quibble, but because it goes to the point that really there is an agency aspect to the Silk Road region. And when you talk about Eurasia or Central Eurasia, or however you want to qualify Eurasia, then it's confusing more or less by construction, because the immediate understanding of the definition, at least in the everyday geopolitical sense, is, hold on, either the Russians have a claim or the Westerners have a claim. And so when you talk about Silk Road region, notwithstanding the Sinocentric connotations, from that you don't immediately, I don't think, get, or at least not to the same degree, aha, it's the Chinese that have a claim on this, especially when the argument is being made by people who look like me and whose name and surname is what it is. So I think that's now, whether that's enough for you, I don't know, but that's certainly one of the main reasons why I would like to I ultimately prefer this term than over some version of Eurasia, however you qualify. I'm not sure you accept that, but that's at least my justification for the moment. This distinction between Keystone State and Keystone Triangle is very difficult to explain and to summarize in 2 sentences, and so I'm not going to try. But I accept that that the logic that you're bringing into it that really does come from your work in complex system is one that certainly has merit. But I don't think that I think it's complementary at the end of the day. I think it doesn't take away from anything that I've said, but because ultimately we're making the same sort of argument. And that comes to this business with the interconnector little one, the joke one, right? To speak colloquially. I agree. If you're going to irritate your northern neighbor, then you have to do it for a significant amount of flow. But I think that what I would do is I would say two things. First, it doesn't mean that you can't start with the first as long as you're reasonably sure or even contractually sure that the second is going to happen, right? So you go for the, what is it? You go for the joke one, as I've called it, but with the expectation or with the contractual obligation, having created some kind of consortium that actually that's just a stopgap to make the Europeans happy, and really what you're going to end up with is the 31 qubits. So I don't know if that's likely, but I think what I've been saying is that there has never been a time where that is more likely to happen than now. Because part of the issue has been, as you know, it's not just the Russians saying, wait a second, what are you doing? It's also because there has been even statutory and regulatory, certainly, hesitancy and otpor, the word in Serbian, hesitancy on behalf of the European Union to authorize this sort of thing, to encourage the funding. And banks tend to not be, IFIs in particular, tend not want to fund new or hydrocarbon projects or sort of expanding existing ones. And so that's an equally and perhaps even more important reason than the Russian one. Now, the point is that given the specific geopolitical circumstances that have to do with the conflict over Ukraine and all that stuff, an exception could be made. This is the point. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying that the circumstances are such that it has never been more likely, which doesn't mean it's going to happen again. All right. So that's, I think, and then that in a way comes back to the 3+3 business. I accept that you're less hopeful than I am on it, but I think you misunderstood. I'm not hopeful. I just think, again, it's like this other thing. I think it's never been more likely because of the various geopolitical circumstances, notwithstanding the fact that Georgia doesn't want to sit at the same table with the Russians. On the other hand, you look at the way that this Georgian government has behaved in the context of the war and the obvious Western pressures to join with the Western-led sanctions and export restrictions regime and all that stuff. And of all the countries in the Silk Road region, the one that you'd think that would do this without really any hesitation would be Georgia. But it hasn't. And it hasn't for complicated reasons that we can get into if you'd like, but the point is that it hasn't. This isn't Saakashvili's Georgia. And so what I'm suggesting is that maybe there's a way, at least conceptually, where all of the players will see, each for their own reasons, to come back to your definition of a complex system. We'll see that engaging in this kind of a format, but not in a formal institutional organizational sense, actually can lead to a better result than doing it bilaterally or trilaterally in the context of Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, right? Because not only just because of the inherent logic of the terms of the statement that was made in November 2020 that ended the war. I mean, that's the beginning of my argument. You just read the document. It's obvious that there's a regional dimension to this. That it's not just that the whole logic behind it is not limited to opening up, a local border between Azerbaijan and Armenia, right? That it's a lot more than that. And what I'm saying is that I think that if you think this through from the perspective of all of the capitals, that there's a logic that could work. Let's see. But the fact is that certainly wasn't the case before November 2020. And I think that the further on we go into time, projecting into the future, that logic is going to get, the salience of that logic is going to increase. And sooner or later, it's going to happen. This is my point. That being said, I agree entirely with what you say on the SCO. I don't think it's going to be an international organization like, the European Union or anything like that, obviously. But what I'm saying is that, and I essentially agree completely with you, and I should have said that explicitly. It's a place where all of the players can come together to figure out how to get things done in other places. But the thing about the SCO that's very interesting, and it's the same thing that's really interesting with the Turkic Council, right, is that there are no Westerners present. All of the relevant non-Western players are present in the SCO and only in the SCO. If you just make a basic list, right, of sort of either Silk Road region core states or some of the ones on the periphery, whether it's your definition or my definition, I think we can more or less, we'd come up with the same list of countries. And then you look at all of that, and then look at any international or regional organization in the world. And the only one where all of the people on that list that you and I could make, and everybody else I think would agree with, that only corresponds to SCO. So, and I think that that's indicative. It doesn't necessarily mean that SCO is going to ever be functional. But the point is that whoever designed this, the SCO as a platform, and then of course, all of the states that are interested in being a part of this, whether through membership or observation or whatever it is, the partnership, whatever the term is, I've forgotten. They're all present there. And I think that that's a really good indication that there's something there. Now, it doesn't function because you've got all the usual rivalries and all that stuff. But the point is, again, if you're with me, Robert, that's the reason I use the example, because it's a really good one to show a broader trend. Everybody who sees himself as being a player at the card table is in the SCO, except for our Western friends. And I think that that's indicative of where this is going to go down the road. Okay. I agree with you in principle. In other words, I accept your logic without having read your work on this, that the disintegration of the current international system, that all of this stuff needs to be, that what I'm talking about needs to be put in place before you have the disintegration of the current international system. On the other hand, well, no, I would disagree in only the following way. I don't think all of it needs to be done. I don't think, I mean, the point is, if you get to beyond embryonic stage, if you get to viability, to use a now standard that can no longer be used in certain aspects, but if you get to viability, then you can build on it. And ASEAN is a really good example of that. But GCC is too, and the other ones that I mentioned in my initial presentation, right? You don't have to be at like at a level of institutional maturity before the international system breaks down in order for this regional order to then be able to okay, you got, I see you're nodding, so that I'm assuming means that we agree. And then the last thing has to do with this Levin Orientalism charge and the use of the term state nationalism. His use of the term state nationalism was used exclusively to describe, for him to try to explain how Putin's Russia works. Okay, now I didn't say that, and I don't think it matters one way or the other, but the point is that I don't think it, and he was, this is, I can't remember when the article was, but it wasn't yesterday. So the point is, and I think this is actually true, and if I had more time, I could get into it. There is something very, very important about understanding Russia as a place of state nationalism, that it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. It doesn't matter, and adherence to the rules is clearly not the thing that's the most important. So what is it? It's loyalty to the state, understood as loyalty to the regime. That doesn't mean strong man, but regime in the Greek sense of politeia, of all of the aspects of the constitutional order, right? Formal and informal. I think that is a very good description if you think it through. And I don't think it's reduced to a strongman argument. So The point is that I don't think that I have this cognitive bias by virtue of the fact that I'm sitting here, in the context of not just that, but also in the context of, what is it that you read now? I've forgotten. Yeah, the values business. Yeah, I want to read to you the way that I did this, because I think you misunderstood me. The Silk Road values are more compatible with respecting the universal principles of international law than they are with what is called by its proponents a rules-based liberal international order. Okay, the point is that all of the countries that you mentioned as a counter argument, all of them profess to adhere to the standards of international law as understood in the UN Charter and derivative documents. All of them at least make this argument as a matter of declaration. Now you can say, well, but that's obviously not true. Fine, but none of them make the other argument or the other declaration, which is we're for a rules-based liberal international order. This is the point that I'm trying to make. So the point is not whether your rhetoric matches your deeds. The point is, what is the nature of your rhetoric? And the nature of your rhetoric in every single Silk Road region country is UN Charter, international law, and all that stuff. And it's not rules-based international liberal order. Okay, that was my point. My point was not whether they were actually, whether the carpets matched the drapes, whether their deeds matched their words. That wasn't my point. And that distinction holds without a doubt.